As a good Chicagoan, I'm going to start with the great mayor of Chicago, Richard Daley. And I will say that one of the things I really admire about this mayor is he has a global mindset. You know, I wish there were more people in Washington, D.C. that had that same global mindset. He travels around the world. He represents this city so well and creates opportunities for the citizens of Chicago in his efforts. And so, Mr. Mayor, I'd like to ask you, what has been what approach do you use in, as you go around the world and as you come back to Chicago, what approach do you use to having Chicago think globally?
I firmly believe that the business community has to do a better job in selling how important trade agreements are to the United States by jobs and economic development. And so what you have to do is, we had mayors from the hemisphere in, we had mayors from China in, and I've traveled, you know, of course, throughout the world, talking about Chicago, of course, our great country. And there has to be a much different approach to the rest of the world. One of the things I've found out is the difficulty of Chicago companies to get quality people coming into the country on visas. I mean, if we're looking for people in math and science, we have to go outside this country. How do we get them in? And that's becoming a major problem. An example, companies in Chicago said, it's easier to relocate my foreign workers into Toronto. Now think of that one. It's easier there. And so that, of course, as mayor of the city of Chicago, I have to deal with that issue. Instead of hiring 200 or 300 people, maybe 75% do come from around the world, 25% from America. They want to be able to go to Canada instead of here, because we can't get our workers in here. And that's becoming a real issue, specialized workers, especially in math, science, and technology field. But getting back to it, how you really make Chicago globalization, you bring the business leaders and the government have to realize this is not a small economy anymore. It's not just Chicago. It's not just the United States. And you see the growth factor, the financial the money interest that the Arab world has in the next 10 or 15 years will change the financial markets of the world. Everything points towards that way because the price of oil going up. So that concerns us. So we have a great outreach from our city into the Arab world because we have an Arab council. We have maybe Arab citizens here in the city of Chicago. So we try to build that relationship off for globalization. We have about 27 sister cities, very active sister cities relationship. At the same time, our companies become our spokesperson. They're the ones who can speak on behalf of my city with their interests throughout the world. At the same time, getting them involved in our city, which is really important.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to go to Dr. Mark Drabenstadt. And this is an Olympic year, and Mark has used an Olympic analogy because he's compared globalization to the Olympics and has talked about economic competition, and with an emphasis on regional economic competition. And Mark, I thought it would be good if you expanded on that analogy and talked a bit about the importance of regional economic competition to keep this whole country competitive.
Well, I really do believe that regions have become the athletes in the global economic Olympics. I think regions are where the impacts of globalization are coming home, both in terms of the pain and the gain. One quick fact makes the case. If you look at all of the industrialized countries around the world over the last 5 years, the range in GDP growth from strongest to weakest across all industrialized economies was 5%. If you go below the national level to the regional level, the range in performance is more than 17%, almost 3 times as wide. So I think it's really at a regional level where much of the focus on economic development is moving. It's really where the action is in an ever-quickening tempo of global markets. This begs the question, of course, what's a region? And the answer, of course, to this is yes. The long answer is that regions form best from the bottom up, not from the top down, and that they represent the natural economic geographies bound together by workforce, by transportation, by business clusters, unique cultural and landscape features. But one thing we do know is that they are no respecter of jurisdictional lines drawn for an earlier economic era. In the U.S., this means that most regions are multi-county and in many cases spill across state lines. The Chicagoland region is a great case in point, many counties stretching across 3 states. I think regions have become a critical framework for competitiveness for 3 important reasons. First, critical mass matters a lot if you want to win the gold in the global economic Olympics. To use the case of Chicago, its competition is not Indianapolis or Milwaukee. Instead, it's London, Madrid, Paris, and Tokyo. And Chicago has enormous assets in this competition, but it's going to take all of them to take on the best in the world. Second, finding your competitive edge or competitive advantage in economics parlance is really essential to success. And this may just sound like plain old common sense, but it's amazing how many cities and counties across America still pursue a 20th century economic development strategy, using whatever financial incentives it takes to recruit a business to their community. There are many events in the global economic Olympics, and it takes the concentrated effort of an entire region to master the field in just a handful. And the third reason why I think regions have really become an essential framework for thinking about competitiveness is that the field of play in the global economic Olympics is shifting in favor of innovation. And more of this innovation happens within the crucible of a region. This means that every U.S. region has to find better things to do instead of just doing old things better. And some regions, like San Diego, Research Triangle, to give just a couple of examples, do this really well. Many others still have a long way to go to build effective regional innovation systems. And I think this is an important frontier to explore and conquer. But a little bit more on that in a moment. What does it take to win if you're a region competing in the global economic Olympics? Well, at its very heart, I think the concept of competitiveness holds a powerful core American value, and that's winning. So what does it take for U.S. regions to take gold in the global economic Olympics? Well, I think there's growing consensus among experts that there are 5 essential building blocks. The first is a strategy, identifying a region's edge in global markets, forging a strategy to exploit that edge, and prioritizing public investments to sustain that edge. The second is partnership. The best evidence also shows that regions who think and act as one region move to the top of the field. Creating region-wide partnerships that cut across public-private sectors is not a natural act, however, especially when a region cuts across county lines and in some cases state lines. Innovation, third key building block. Deliberate investments in innovation tied to the region's economic edge will pay huge dividends. While that seems obvious, the how to do this is far more complex. Every region has its own distinct economic niches, and every region also has its unique landscape of public-private research and development institutions. And to bring all of these together into a regional innovation system is really a difficult, complex task and represents, I think, a very important frontier. Fourth key building block, entrepreneurship. We talked about a lot of this earlier today, so I won't belabor the point, but I think it is the case increasingly that regions must grow more of their future in their own backyard because business recruitment is facing diminishing returns in a globalizing economy. And lastly, synergies, the last building block. Every region has to exploit critical links with neighboring regions that add to the economic upside. No region is an island unto itself, but rather has powerful ties with other regions that can leverage its own competitive advantage. Rural-urban linkages are a good example of this. Chicago is going to compete with Paris and London, but its ties to the agricultural powerhouse just beyond the Metroplex, can make Chicago's bid for gold even stronger. For instance, Chicago has powerful research institutions that may discover medical therapeutics that could be grown in Illinois fields. London simply can't do that. Finally, just a couple of words on the importance of regional innovation. One of the nation's leading authorities on innovation, Professor Michael Piori at MIT, suggests that innovation is the result of two powerful but competing forces. One force he calls the creative dimension. And think of what we're going to enjoy in about an hour, a cocktail party. The other dimension is the one he calls the analytical dimension. Think of engineers and MBAs. These two dimensions used to be housed within single corporations. AT&T, for instance, had Bell Labs, the cocktail party, and Western Electric, the engineers and MBAs. Globalization, however, is forcing corporate America to cut back on the creative side of the house in many cases. Thus, a fascinating question is whether regions can supply the framework in which innovation happens in the place of corporations. Places like Research Triangle and San Diego offer reason to believe the answer is yes, and helping all U.S. regions do this really well, I think, marks an important frontier.